Father asked me to speak briefly, and I think what I'd like to focus us on, because it is such an important foundational expression of our faith, I'd like to focus us on the cross. These days are dedicated very specifically to the cross of Christ. And in our churches, you'll notice, and there is really a great difference between the way that the crucifixion is depicted in Byzantine churches. There's a difference between other Eastern churches, such as the Maronite or Syrian churches, the Antiochian churches. And then there is a greater difference in the way the crucifixion is depicted in the West, in the Roman Catholic Church. In the Roman Catholic Church, the most traditional images of the crucifixion are quite realistic and in many cases even pretty graphic. Although, in looking at the reality of crucifixion, it's still pretty tame to the reality. How many of you have seen the film The Passion of the Christ? Okay. One of the criticisms that came of that film was that it was very particularly gory. And however, from a historical standpoint, it was actually very accurate. And so the goriness, although we probably could have used a little less of it to convey the crucifixion, it's probably pretty accurate as to how the crucifixion looked. Now in our church, I mentioned, so there are three different approaches. The approach of the Antiochian tradition, because we as Byzantine, so we're connected to Constantinople, whereas the Antiochian tradition, the Syriac tradition, which has a close connection to the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, their focus is usually the cross without the body of Christ. And so you'll see the cross, and the cross will be made in such a way that it seems to be growing, that there are leaves or tendrils that are coming from it, because they want to depict the cross as something that is alive as opposed to something that is dead. So this way the cross points to life as opposed to being the dead end. And so in that tradition, in the Maronite tradition, in the Syriac tradition, in the traditions of the Indian Catholic and Orthodox churches, and also in the tradition of the Armenian church, you'll find that same type of a cross that seems to be organically alive. And very rarely will you find the body attached to the cross. And within the Byzantine tradition, the way that Jesus is depicted, he's depicted in a very clean and graceful position on the cross. The body hangs in a way that very often is elongated, and the body may be slightly curved. And Jesus will always appear to be almost standing in front of the cross, even though his head may be down and his eyes closed. And that is because the church has depicted or has decided to depict the theology of the crucifixion as opposed to the reality. So whereas in the Western tradition, the attempt is more to depict the reality of the crucifixion, in the East, in the Byzantine East, we depict more what we believe. And we believe that Christ died on the cross of his own volition. And even in death, he remained fully in control. And so he is never on the cross, in a sense, as a passive victim. And so even as he hangs somehow, in some way, in control as God. So he's never been compromised in that sense. And that's what we see. So when you go to the church, or if you have the icon of the crucifixion, that is exactly what we observe when we see the depiction of the crucifixion or of Christ on the cross. However, the reality of the crucifixion, just looking at some of the historical background, the crucifixion is, as a method of execution, is probably the most cruel of all history. There is no form of execution that was as horrible as the crucifixion. And the ancient Romans probably picked up this form of torture from the ancient peoples of North Africa. The North Africans used to not crucify, but they would tie and sometimes nail people to trees, especially thieves and pirates. And they would nail them on these trees that were still alive, that were growing along the coast, so that when a pirate ship would try to land close to a town or a village, they would see this, and the bodies would be left there, so it would be, even weeks after the death of the person, it would stand as a warning. The Romans, when they conquered the whole Mediterranean, so they picked up different things from different cultures, and this was probably one of them. The way that crucifixion was done was to prolong the death. The key was to make the person live as much as he or she could before finally succumbing, usually by asphyxiation. The person would be, and this is one of the things when we hear about Helena's finding of the true cross, you wonder when you read the story, it's, well, how could Helena find wood after 300 years of crucifixions? Because Jesus was not the only one crucified there. Many people were crucified there. And so where could this wood have come from? After all, 300 years, it would have rotted, it would have disappeared. And the fact was that for crucifixions, Romans would make the person bear the arm beam. And so it was, because we see the romanticized images of Jesus carrying a full cross, which would have actually been physically pretty much impossible for him, especially in his state after having been tortured and scourged. And so the arm beam was the piece that was carried by the person, and then coming to the spot of crucifixion, there would be an enormous beam of wood made from the strongest woods that last for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that beam was planted deep into the ground, and it stood there on that spot with other beams, because that was the usual place of crucifixion. And that was the piece that was, so to speak, used over and over again, recycled. And so that piece stayed there. And so that is probably what St. Helena found. A piece of that beam which would have in fact been the cross not only of Christ, but also that would have been the place where many others were crucified. And Jesus would have been affixed to the wood through nails through his wrists. And then when suspended, his feet would have been also affixed so that he could have a little bit of support, to a way of standing. Now, this form of crucifixion was used by the Romans very often. For example, I'm sure you've all heard of Spartacus. So in ancient history, during the Third Servile War, Spartacus led a revolution against the Romans, and 6,000 men were crucified. And they were crucified along a 200-kilometer road from the city of Capua, which is the city famous for Romeo and Juliet, all the way down to the city of Rome itself. At regular intervals, there were crosses. And also St. Peter was crucified on the cross. However, he made a special request when he was crucified that he not be crucified in the same way of Christ, because he had denied Christ. And so St. Peter was crucified upside down. St. Andrew, the brother of St. Peter, was crucified on an X-shaped cross. And the St. Simeon of Jerusalem, who was the second bishop of Jerusalem, was crucified in the city of Jerusalem in the year 106. Now, so crucifixions continued throughout the reign of the Romans, and eventually it was Constantine who changed all of this. Now, Constantine had, in the year 312, he was part of a Roman Empire that was coming to an end. It had become very corrupt. The political realities, the senatorial families were no longer really concerned about the continuation of the Roman Empire and its glory. They were being paid off. They were doing things for themselves and not for the good of their empire. And Roman religion had also become very, very watered down, because as the Romans conquered multiple nations and peoples, in their attempt to create a new Rome, they absorbed the different religious traditions. And so that's where you get in Rome, you have ancient places of worship such as the Pantheon, which were a place dedicated to all gods. And it was because they brought, when they conquered different nations, they brought their divinities to the city of Rome, and very often they also brought priests and people who would be able to worship according to that religious tradition. So the Roman religion was kind of a smorgasbord. It was a buffet of, you can pick and choose what you like, and it no longer really held the hearts of the Roman people themselves. And that was one of the reasons why many of the Romans began to look in other places. And by the time of Constantine in the early 4th century, there were many, many, many Christians. One of these Christians was Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine. And she, who came from Asia Minor, what's today Turkey, she had converted at some point to Christianity, probably from the local church there. She was a simple woman, a waitress, and when the Roman emperor, not emperor, but one of the generals, Constantinus, came through her part of Asia Minor, he stayed at the hotel where she worked. And she was serving his table and came and brought him his dinner. And he noticed that she had a ring on. And it was the exact same ring that he was wearing. Now, of course, this is before a lot of mass production, so it was kind of coincidental. And the ancient Romans, of course, they were also very, very superstitious. And so he took this as some sort of a divinely sanctioned sign. And so he courted her and eventually married her right there in that town. Of course, from this comes Constantine. And so Constantine is then raised really far from his father, who is off doing political things. And his father, Constantinus, eventually disowns Constantine because the Roman senatorial families that wanted to bring Constantinus into a rank of co-emperor, they saw that he was his marriage was not politically well planned, and so they annulled his marriage to Helena and declared Constantine illegitimate. And so Constantine himself and his mother kind of hounded Constantinus. They went up to all the way as far as England, where Constantinus was, and eventually he recognized Constantine as his legitimate son, bringing Constantine into a mess, because there were a number of rulers and children and illegitimate children and legitimate children from the different candidates for the leadership of the Roman Empire, and these vied for the same power. And so Constantine had his work cut out. All this sets things up for the battle that took place outside of the city of Rome in October of 312, when Constantine was to face off against Maxentius, and these two were supposed to, at one time, be co-emperors of the Roman Empire. However, because of politics and intrigue, they came to battle it out right at the gates of the city of Rome. And on October 27th, when the sun set, so according to the historical record, when the sun set, a number of the soldiers saw in the sky, and the sunset was a spectacular one of many different colors. And they saw what looked like cross in the sky. And Constantine himself had also noticed it. And that evening he had a vision, and in that vision he heard a voice that told him, "In this sign you will be victorious." And so he took and ordered all of his men to inscribe this cross, and the cross is a Greek-style cross of two bars, basically of the same length, and to inscribe and paint that on all of the horses, all of the armor, and the banners. And he went into battle on the 28th of October, 312, and he defeated Maxentius, whose armies were larger and better trained, and yet Constantine was victorious. And this began Constantine's journey. Constantine was not a Christian. He was seemingly unaware of his mother's own religious journey and her conversion to Christianity. And he began this process of trying to find out where this symbol fits. From which religious tradition does it come? It wasn't a symbol used by Christians. because at this time Christians were persecuted. And the symbol most commonly associated with Christians was the fish. And this symbol of the fish, and it's not necessarily because of anything from the life of Christ, it is because the word fish in Greek, which is ichthys, it's 5 letters. Each of the letters stands for a word. And so you have I, the first letter, iota, is Isus. The second letter, the he, is Christos, Christ. The third letter is the theta, and that is Theou, which is of God, or gods. And then Ipsilon, which is like a U or a Y, and that's Uios, which is Son. And the final letter, the Sigma, which is for Sotir, Savior. And so it was the first profession of faith. Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And that was the symbol that was used by Christians. Now, of course, also, people didn't think of the cross as being what we see today on churches, of being 2 bars crossed over. Because the cross was this beam that was planted into the earth, and then the arm part would be hoisted up, either to the top or below the top of it. So it wasn't quite recognizable. And it was St. Helena who recognized what it was, and then began with this recognition, began in Constantine's life this process of conversion. Now Constantine, in our church he is recognized as a saint. In the Roman Catholic Church he's not recognized as a saint. However, that's probably just a question of tradition. Remember that Constantine had a very hard time in Rome, even though he won the city of Rome and won the empire in the year 312. He then went on to legalize Christianity, meaning that all Christians could now worship publicly. They could build places of worship, they could own property, and they could be, they would not have to fear any sort of persecution. And to get that process started, Constantine himself built the old St. Peter's Basilica and St. John on the Lateran Hill, the cathedral of the city of Rome. And then his mother, with his money, went and built the Basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and many other churches and chapels. That, of course, did not win him any favor with the Roman old senatorial families. And so they began to fight against him. And the fight became so bitter that St. Helena moved to Trier, which is in Germany, and that was one of the summer residences of the Roman emperors. And Constantine began plans to build a new capital. And so in the year 324, he founded the city of Constantinople, or today Istanbul. And he founded that as a co-capital for the Roman Empire. However, when he left, since he was the emperor, so everyone who was associated with him, all of the rich families that had politically aligned themselves with him, they also left and went to Constantinople, leaving Rome a little bit, decrepit. Financially, they lost a lot of their foundation, and probably that may be the reason why in the Roman Catholic Church Constantine is not considered a saint, because that's the ultimate way of kind of getting even. And so Constantinople declared him a saint. Rome did not. However, his process of conversion took many different steps. He did many different things to establish the faith that we celebrate today. He made it, firstly, illegal to persecute Christians. He also discontinued the use of crucifixion as a means of capital punishment. And as he, in his own process, went through his conversion, eventually, close to his own death, he was baptized. And see, and this is why the church recognizes him as a saint, because although he waited, he wasn't exactly eager to get baptized. He probably realized that as an emperor, he was going to have to kill a few of his enemies. So he waited until towards the end of his life, and he was baptized because baptism takes away all sins. So, good model, I guess. But Constantine, and you're lucky because you have in your temple, in your church, you have the icon of Constantine there. And indeed, he's a complicated man. And once again, a reminder that in God's plan, and this plan of salvation, there are many inconvenient characters. And there are many people who, do not necessarily walk surrounded by angels and walk on clouds. They've gone through their own personal crises and difficulties. And Helena is one of them, although her life is not as well documented as Constantine's. Both of them had a very difficult life in their search for Jesus Christ. And in those challenges, they were the ones who first found the cross as this essential symbol, a reminder of death, yes, but a sign of the promise of the resurrection. And in that, a sign that is very strong, very effective, a sign that for us is ever present, a sign that, as I said this morning, that we wear around our necks, we have in our homes, we have in our cars. And so when you see that sign, be reminded that this is our faith. This is what we believe, and this is what we celebrate as Christians. Thank you.